Well, welcome everybody to the Yoga Philosophy Study Group Book Club, coming to you from the Yoga Center Chico. I'm Lauren Carley, and this is Tom Hess, an owner of the Yoga Center of Chico. In this series, we are studying now The Light on Life by BKS Iyengar. And we're also studying how it relates to your life here, now, today, as you live your life. So today we're starting chapter 4. We're going to do chapter 4 in 2 parts. And today we'll be summarizing page 107 through 131. If you have maybe a different edition, essentially it takes you up to, but we won't be getting to it until part 2, the section on samskaras. We'll be going up to that section. Each session is recorded. It can be found on the Yoga Center of Chico's YouTube channel, where you can also find links to other recordings that are done from the Philosophy Study Group or other recordings, asana sequences. Each session is also live at the YCC broadcast on Zoom. We open up a Zoom channel. These occur on the fourth Thursday of every month, starting at 5:30 Pacific time. They're free and anyone can join in. If you want to be on the mailing list, go to the Yoga Center of Chico's website, where you can contact Tom and or I and get on the mailing list and get the handouts, and then get signed up for any notices. Now I'm going to summarize part 1, chapter 4, and then Tom will conclude with some of his thoughts and comments, so you get both of our ideas. And we usually agree on these things, but sometimes we're different people. We come from different backgrounds and we see things a little differently. So you're lucky to get at least 2 views on this material. Well, my jumping in point here, chapter 4, the Manamaya Kosha, the mental body, so to speak. My jumping in point is I want to go to Patanjali's Sutra number 1.2, where he talks about yoga is the process of stilling the movements, the fluctuations of the mind, chitta, that disturb our consciousness. Yoga is about stilling the fluctuations of the mind. Now, Mr. Iyengar added the phrase that disturb our consciousness. And this chapter is all about what we mean by that and what we mean by the chitta, particularly. There's 3 big whys of why we might want to study this material. And these whys, in my humble opinion, are why this book, Light on Life, is comparable in impact on a yoga practitioner along with the sutras and the Gita. Big why number 1. This is Iyengar now speaking, through our intelligence, we change. Let's see here. Through our intelligence, we can change ourselves, freeing ourselves from the ingrained patterns of behavior and steer ourselves incrementally towards illumination. The big why, page 108. Okay, big why number 2, page 125. Learn to use our ego as a necessary tool for living, not as a substitute for the soul. Big why number 3, freedom. Freedom from the ego limiting ourselves within its pettiness, fear, and its cravings. Freedom to choose a path towards the divine. The 3 big whys of why are we even spending any time on this material and why this book is so important. So at the beginning of this chapter, Mr. Iyengar sets out a task, and he says that we should first, if we want to go to these big whys and gain freedom and be able to look at our ego objectively and deal with some of the problems in our life, that we should first look carefully at our consciousness. Now, period. See what elements combine to make it up and analyze how they work together. And I will add to look at our consciousness and the elements that make it up as much as we explore our body through our asana practice, our limbs, our torso, our neck, a big toe, and so on. Mm. The scope of this part one is a model, and Iyengar uses that term in his book, but the way he lays out how to understand the parts of the consciousness as a model. It's not the only model, but it's the model that he presents in this book. It's a very common model that you see in the sutras and Upanishads. This is where this material comes from. Iyengar didn't make this up, but what he did that was genius is he brought it to common everyday language and he used common everyday examples throughout this section to illustrate what he's talking about. Because this really is everyday stuff. And what the model is that there's three parts, depending on who you talk to and what you look at. But the traditional classic view is there's three parts to your mind. And I want to say there's kind of a problem with using the word mind in English, because mind can translate to one of the parts, but mind can also translate the entire consciousness. I'm going to try and delineate these so there's no confusion. So the scope of this part one discussion talks about these three breakdowns. The manas, M-A-N-A-S, or I'm going to say the manas mind, because sometimes you see manas translated as mind, but also mind is used in English to mean the entire chitta, the whole consciousness. So the manas is the first one, the B-U-D-D-H-I, buddhi, the second, and the ahamkara, the ego, essentially in simple English, is the third, the buddhi being the intellect or the intelligence. And he also says that these three make up the consciousness, but the sum of these three, in the consciousness, the consciousness is greater than the sum of these three by how these three act together. And then he goes on page 109. The mind is described as an aspect or a part of the consciousness. The mind forms the outer layer of the chitta. Consciousness means our capacity to be aware, our self-awareness. That's what we're talking about here, because you can get on a big old debate with people about what is consciousness and what is not. But for this purpose, consciousness means our capacity to be aware, our self-awareness. So we're going to come back to this in a moment. So now let's get into some depth of definitions and a few other terms that come into play here. So to visualize this model, this three-part model, manas, ahamkara, buddhi, that's usually presented in that order. The manas mind is what he explains is the outer layer. And the reason he says the outer layer, because of course we're on this inward journey in this book, and we're going through the journey of the koshas. So the manamaya kosha is actually what we're talking about is broken down into these different layers. The manas mind is the outer layer. Why? Because it sits next to our five senses. And the manas mind, you might say, is our CPU, central processing unit. It's our recorder. It's what the senses bring into our mind and says, oh, that's red. Oh, it's cold. Oh, it's hot. It's just as noting, storing. It's also where our memory lies. So it makes sense that the manas mind would be positioned not physically, but virtually, you might say, next to the senses, because it's recording everything. It presents itself as our personality. No, I'm sorry, I skipped the part. The second one, the buddhi, B-U-D-D-H-I, is the intellect. And Iyengar and others present that as then the next inner layer. It's the intelligence. The intelligence uses the manas mind. It uses its warehouse of information. It uses its history. It uses its memory. So it needs to sit nearby. And then the deeper, most inner layers of ahamkara, the ego. And it presents itself as our personality. It's what we call our little s self. And it assumes the identity of the true self, but it's not the true self, the little s self. So when you hear that term, we're talking about the ego, at least in terms of how it's presented in this book. These three work together proportionally. And what that means is if one is bigger, the other shrinks. If one is predominant out in front, the others are behind the scenes. And a lot of times you feel this, or you sense this in your body. If your ego's out in front, so a lot of times your intelligence is behind the scenes, trying to get a word in edgewise, so to speak. And Iyengar says on page 111, yoga explains how these three react when they encounter the real world. And this chapter has some great examples. I'm not going to read all the examples in the interest of time. You go read them, but they are delightful examples. They make me laugh every time I read them. And he also points out that each of these has a negative and positive aspect to them. There, for the manas, the ahamkara, and the buddhi, all can be a positive side to us. But then if they get inflated and out of control, there's also a negative aspect to them. So we're having to balance these back and forth between negative, positive, negative, positive. He introduces the term tapas. I think we've heard that already in this book, but he talks about using tapas, which is energy or fire or heat. It's a buildup of energy is the way I like to see it, to work, to do the hard work, of not taking the easy path, to do more of what we don't want to do more of what we should do to get over the moment of inertia, and to do less of what we should not do. Hope that made sense. So it takes clarity of mind, and Iyengar suggests here's a kind of a task or a practice. Learn to like doing the things you have to do anyway. And he quotes Descartes, a famous European philosopher, learn to do the things that we have to do anyway. And that brings to mind, I think it's a quote from the Buddha, but I think a lot of people have been attributed to this. What happens when you what happens when you achieve enlightenment? Chop wood, carry water. The same thing. Okay, so we have a more detailed discussion starting on page 113 on the manas. Again, in the interest of time, I won't go into all the details here, and Tom may want to highlight some of these details I'm going to skip over. And page 117, he gives more details on the I shape, the ahamkara, the ego, the shape of the small self. He does note that the ahamkara fears most its own death in the future, but it is also the basis of our individuality. One of my favorite jokes is, you might think that the last person to leave the stage when you die of these big three is the ego, but no, the ego likes to go to its own funeral. And then the third one on page 123, intelligence. This is our discernment, ability to discern. It's our ability to innovate. It's our ability to change ourselves, to create a new relationship with the ego. And I won't do it here, but I can tell you some stories of my personal life where that has happened. It's reflexive. It can see itself. It can perceive itself objectively. This is where the change happens. It can choose. It gets back to one of the big whys. Why are we even studying this? Right there, because once you tune into this model, use it as a tool, it helps you to choose a different path. And he also introduces the concept of the will or volition. He says it's a characteristic of the intelligence. I've seen it other places where kind of a separate part of the mind. Won't need to get in that philosophical debate here, but the will is very important. I call my will my BFF, my best friend forever. I can always call on it when I need help to make a change. And then he also introduces a term, darshan. Know that we know. This is getting back to what I talked about in the beginning, that once we study this model, once we use the model, once we tune in the model, once the model becomes personal, we see it in ourselves, we can reach a level where we know, where our consciousness is aware of being conscious. And everybody has that capacity to do that. It takes some practice, it takes some effort, but it's all reachable. And then he says, suddenly, and I underline this in red, suddenly the ego becomes an object. We can see ourselves objectively and make a change to the relationship with the ego. And then he goes on to talk a little bit more about how these three work together in the last part of this part one. Page 126. Intelligence has the ability to freeze frame the flow of thought, but it takes practice. I added that term, it takes practice, because I've been through a lot of this. It is what he is saying here. Intelligence has the ability to freeze frame the flow of thought. I found to be true, and learn the hard way how to do that. He says we call it cognition, but it's hard. It's hard to freeze frame when the ego is dominant and taking you off where you don't want to go. So one of the things that he recommends here is a practice, and I'll add a couple of these two to the practice list. It takes place daily with the small tasks, and the tasks that we naturally do or don't particularly enjoy. In other words, challenge your consciousness. Pick a tiny task, not an easy one. Pick a neutral one, or maybe a little bit difficult task, and try to freeze frame it. Walk yourself through it and see what's going on, and see if you can't change. We'll see the role of the manas, see the role of the ahamkara, the ego, and the intelligence, and see if you can't change the outcome. It starts with a little everyday task. It starts with your asana practice. It starts with stepping on the mat. And when I teach yoga asana practice, I like to say stepping on the mat is about the fourth step into your practice. Then we'll start doing tadasana or something like that. And then he talks a little bit, in wrapping up, he talks about the will, my BFF in my case. It gets you on your feet. It translates our awareness of a choice. Now we have an awareness of a choice into action. And he says hatha yoga is like the equivalent of the yoga of the will. And also tied in with the will is, of course, tapas. It's that energy that it takes to overcome the moment of inertia. You gain self-control, you can make changes. The changes can lead to freedom in your life. And freedom leads us towards, as Iyengar says, towards unity and not separation. And I will say, I think the world needs more of that right now. It always needs more of that. So I want to wrap up and encourage you to at least read page 128 to 130. Read what I call his famous ice cream example, where he takes something as simple as coming home from work, I won't give it away, and writes out the dialogue between the manas, the ahamkara, and the buddhi, and the result of it. And it is a great example that everybody can relate to. And once you see the freeze frame dialogue written out, I hope that you can start seeing this in other parts of your life and start testing it and start strengthening your ability to see. Because from my perspective, and the reason why I do this work with Tom is because yoga is all about developing a way of seeing. In my case, my joke might be capital S seeing with your mind's eye, like capital S self. Okay, with that, let me turn over to Tom for his comments and fill in any blanks or correct anything I might have somehow gotten completely wrong. Tom?
Thank you, Lauren. It was a perfectly good, very detailed, good explanation of the chapter. I'm just going to sort of simplify it a little bit, the way that I think of it. Um, I think of the chitta or the consciousness as this umbrella, and underneath this chitta, you have the mind, the ahamkara, and the intelligence, the buddhi. And this relationship between the two, and the buddhi is the one that gives us an opportunity to make a choice. And, Lauren described the description in the book about Iyengar and the whole ice cream analogy, a comparison. And you can understand it when you start to look at it, that the big deal here is making the right choice, not making the traditional old habitual choice. And that's a little bit of a precursor to the samskaras, because those habits with time become samskaras. So we're really looking to break this habitual pattern that we all have. And oftentimes that habitual pattern is based on avoiding pain and being attracted to pleasure. And then we can do a whole discussion about the length of time for all of those things. But that's sort of how I see it. And the key is making that we have a choice, and the intelligence is what will guide us towards the correct choice. Whether that choice be the habitual patterns that we've been doing all along, or to change a pattern that might be a little bit self-destructive, or not even self-destructive, just not in the path that we want to follow. So I think it's a very important idea to come to realize that we have this power within us to make a choice away from habits or less enlightened thoughts than we might, and we can move it in the other way. Other than that, we'll talk about samskaras next month, and please join us Thursday at our live Yoga Center Chico, 5:30 to 7, last Thursday of every month. And not last, fourth Thursday of every month, excuse me. Uh, Other than that, back to you, Lauren.
All right, unmute. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Namaste to you.
Namaste.